There is something rotten in the states of Georgia. There's a reason why I talk about voter suppression as much as I do, because I understand what is at stake and I understand how suppressing, 2 to 3% of the vote can swing an election and allow people to win who may not have won had it not been for voter suppression. I've said before that I believe voter suppression played an integral role in getting Donald Trump elected. Very, very few people are talking about that and how impactful the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2013 by the Supreme Court was in the 2016 election. There are some incredibly well-written and well-researched articles all over the internet by groups like the Brennan Center for Justice, who I retweet a lot, but elsewhere as well, and like the article that I'm going to be reading from today from Slate.com. I mean, the mountain of evidence proving conclusively not only how widespread voter suppression is in this country, but how many tactics they have that they can use at their leisure to maintain their right-wing grip on power. Okay? There's a mountain of evidence showing that. No one wants to talk about this because there is nothing that really gets at the heart of the weakness of American democracy more than voter suppression. I say all of that as an intro to the main topic of today, which is the current attempt by allies of Brian Kemp, the current Secretary of State of Georgia, who is running for governor of Georgia against Stacey Abrams, to close 7 of 9 polling stations in the predominantly black Randolph County over what they claim to be violations of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, before I continue, I want to remind everyone of an article I've mentioned before in previous videos from The Nation entitled, "There are 868, and this was written in 2016, by the way, there are 868 fewer places to vote in 2016 because the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act." I repeat, the title of the article is "There are 868 fewer places to vote in 2016 because the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act." 868. This was before the 2016 election. This was in the lead up to the 2016 election. The overwhelming number of them occurred in the South and Southwest, overwhelmingly impacting people of color. There are charts I've seen that show the trends of how black people were voting from 2004 through 2008, 2012, and all the, midterm elections along the way. And you saw a steady increase, okay? You saw a steady increase in the number of black people voting. Then, strangely enough, in 2016, there was this inexplicable plummet in black turnout. Now, this was mostly chalked up to, black people just didn't turn out to vote. Nah, I'm not buying that. Because if I remember correctly, I don't have the chart right up in front of me right now, but if I remember correctly, the turnout in 2016 for black voters was on par with what it was in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. I might have to find that chart again, but the turnout literally plummeted. And that's not normal. That's not a normal decrease in turnout, okay? No, I don't buy that. 2016 saw a huge amount of voter suppression by a variety of measures being implemented. Okay, I bring this up because we have to acknowledge how important voter suppression is to the right wing and their maintenance of power. We gotta be real about that, because a lot of people aren't being real about that. A lot of people are kind of just acting like these people are winning fair and square, and that's BS. And the more you research voter suppression, the more you realize it's BS. Now I'm gonna explain that even more as I go along in this video. Now, going back to Georgia, meanwhile in Georgia, do you seriously think the right wing isn't going to pull out all of the stops to make sure a black woman doesn't become the next governor of Georgia? Do you seriously think voter suppression isn't going to be one of their primary weapons to use against Stacey Abrams? Because let's be real, Brian Kemp's politics and his policy agenda is trash. Let's not beat around the bush. He's not going to win because his ideas are better. Brian Kemp is not going to win in the so-called marketplace of ideas. Okay, and this is a conundrum a lot of right-wing politicians find themselves in. They know their ideas are not really that popular. So instead of changing their policy agendas, which they don't want to do, they simply rig the game to make it harder for their opponents to win. And they've been doing this for decades. Voter suppression is not new, and it's not a conspiracy theory. The only people who say that are those who are just completely ignorant of U.S. history, and most importantly, the history of voting rights. Okay, the right wing has literally conspired to suppress the votes against black people since the end of slavery. This is on record. Why do you think they had to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the first place? Because of the black codes, because of grandfather clauses, because of literacy tests, and a bunch of other things, a bunch of other old methods that they used to employ, that they used to do to rig the vote, that was essentially, abolished and banned in 1965. So they had to create new things. They had to create new methods. So it's not grandfather clauses anymore. It's voter ID. It's not literacy tests anymore. It's the closing of polling stations. It's the same it's the same tactic. Same-ish, different trash can. Now, I said ish specifically not to curse. I'm trying not to do that in this video, at least not too much. The last video I posted about Alex Jones, I got a little carried away. And if you watch that video, and I was really animated in that video, and I'm animated with this story too, but I'm gonna self-censor a little bit. Okay, so Slate.com, I mentioned Slate earlier, so I mentioned it a few minutes ago. Slate.com is hit or miss sometimes, but they actually have a good article about this written by Mark Joseph Stern, and he's written about voter suppression in the past from time to time, and he writes about how the seven polling stations that the Randolph County Election Board is trying to close were all open during the May primaries and the July runoffs. They were open. So it's funny, no one was making these claims about the ADA back then a few months ago. Literally, the July runoffs were like last month. Okay? It's only now that the midterms are coming up and you have a race to decide the next governor, and a black female Democrat is on the ballot, trying to make history and trying to help out the progressive cause. Now all of a sudden they're twisting logic to change the rules. And see, this is how they play. This is how they play dirty. This is how they essentially rig elections. And again, people don't want to use that type of language, but I think we're at the point now where we need to stop being politically correct. And we need to just call it what it is. They're rigging elections. If this goes through, it would force local residents, and this is what the article says, if this goes through, it would force local residents to travel 30 miles to the nearest polling station, and there would only be 2 left in the county, by the way. So because they're trying to close 7 of 9. So there would only be 2 polling stations in the entire county, and everybody else who was in a location where a polling station would be closed, they have to travel out of their way across the county somewhere just to vote. This will hurt people who don't have transportation, whether by car or by public transit. Or maybe they do have transportation, but they don't have the means, or they don't have the resources to drive all the way across the county somewhere. You can't assume everybody's going to do this. And they know that. Like, they know people are going to just say, well, screw it, I'm just not going to vote. They know people are going to get discouraged and not vote, and that's what they're counting on. Okay. This is also important from the article. He writes about how, because of Randolph County's history of racist voting laws, they were previously forced to seek federal permission to do something like this. Okay, this was before the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 2013, which is why I brought that up earlier. You see how much damage the Supreme Court can do, right? That decision was nothing more. That 2013 decision by the Supreme Court, and I remember Antonin Scalia wrote the opinion, if that's the right wording for it, as to why that decision should have been made. That was nothing more than a gift to white supremacy in politics. Nothing more, nothing less. That decision by the Supreme Court has only created more problems. It didn't solve a damn thing. Okay, these decisions are being made by the court, by the Supreme Court, to allow this type of stuff to happen. It opened the floodgates for historic, widespread racist voter suppression. It was easily one. I mean, if you made a list of the terrible decisions by the Supreme Court, okay, you would have to include Citizens United. You'd have to include some other things, and then you definitely have to include the 2013. What was it? Shelby versus Holder, if I'm not mistaken. Hold on, let me check that out really quick while I'm being recorded. Yeah, that's what it was. Shelby County versus Holder. Some things you just don't forget. Like that Supreme Court decision in 2013, like that was a particularly bad one. You know, so you have Citizens United, you have Shelby versus Holder. And the Supreme Court even ruled in favor of voter purges recently this year. So they're just taking all sorts of blowtorches to voting rights in this country. The Supreme Court is terrible in the United States. I mean, they sometimes get certain things right, but they get a lot of things wrong. Things that do real damage to democracy in this country. So listen to this. This is from the article. To understand the brazen attack on black suffrage now occurring in Randolph County, it's important to remember that Georgia is in the midst of a seismic demographic shift. It's important to remember. As whites cease to be the majority in more and more counties, Republicans have clung to power by disenfranchising minority voters. So the author here is basically stating what I just said, that voter suppression is keeping the right wing in power, literally. And it's going to become more and more obvious as the white voting power decreases year after year after year. We have to stop looking at this as something that isn't deciding elections. Like, that's clearly erroneous. And the seismic demographic shifts have a lot to do with why, voter suppression is coming back in full swing to begin with. You cannot disassociate the changing demographics in this country with the increase of voter suppression in this country. The two, I think that the two are linked, because they don't care about black people voting for mayors, and getting these local wins and things like that. They don't care. They might not like that, but especially if you're putting like prosecutors in power who might agree with you, and you're getting their racist prosecutors out of office, like the guy who just lost in St. Louis County. I forget his name because it's not important, but I just did a video about it. The loser in that case is not important. The winner is definitely important. But they'll give black people those types of wins. When you start talking about state senators, you start talking about state legislatures, which of course state senators are part of state legislatures. When you start talking about governors and presidents, that's when you start to see the screw jobs. I was thinking about another word, but again, I said I'm trying to self-censor a little bit. That's when you see the con jobs come out when it comes to voting rights in this country. because they do not want black people and other people of color uh, putting people who are going to represent them, or at least even, or just not even just represent us, but just be more progressive in general. They don't want people of color having a huge amount of influence in who runs this country. Okay, that is the reason why voter suppression has always existed. It exists to allow white society to maintain political power. That's essentially what it boils down to. Now let's move on to Brian Kemp and dig into his past a little bit. He is a major threat to black voters in Georgia, and the amount of damage he could do as governor is something that, I don't even want to think of. The article says, quote, during his nearly 8 years as Secretary of State, listen to this, Kemp engaged in mass voter purges, removing hundreds of thousands of voters from the rolls. State officials appear to have singled out black voters in targeted purges. Kemp also canceled or suspended 35,000 voter registrations using Exact Match, a version of Chris Kobach's notorious cross-check program that compares registrants' information with DMV and Social Security databases. If a single letter, space, or hyphen did not match the database information, the voter application was rejected. Black voters were 8 times more likely than whites to have their registrations halted due to Exact Match. Let me repeat that. Black voters were 8 times more likely than whites to have their registrations halted due to this cross-check-esque platform known as Exact Match, which Exact Match, it's basically cross-check with another name. That's all it is. They just rebranded it. When I say voter suppression is the reason Trump won in 2016, most of the time I'm not only talking about voter ID laws, felony disenfranchisement, which is huge in states like Florida, where I want to say something like 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 black men are legally blocked from voting because of criminal records. Voter purges, the closing of polling stations, all of these things are known to impact people of color voters overwhelmingly more than white voters. But I'm also talking about interstate cross-check, which I've talked about at length in the past. I haven't really talked about it recently. Here, the author is linking Brian Kemp with Chris Kobach's scheme that was implemented in states all over the country before 2016. It's easily the biggest story of the 2016 election that nobody wants to talk about. Not on the left and not on the right. So in Georgia, they don't call it cross-check. They just call it Exact Match. But it's, like I said, it's the same daggone system. Mind you, you have Kobach running for governor in Kansas. He just won the Republican primary through very sketchy means. It looks like there was some chicanery going on in Kansas too to get So you have this. So you have these architects of anti-democratic voter suppression like Kobach, Kemp, running for major offices in multiple states. Okay, this is not some small matter. If you care about the long-term value of democracy, whatever is left of it, in America, you should be covering this story. It's amazing how you have these major progressive platforms that don't think voter suppression is important enough to cover on a consistent basis, even though it's going to affect progressives more than anybody else. But they're more worried about Alex Jones being deplatformed, That's what keeps them up at night. But, I'm going to digress. If you want to know my opinions on that, watch my previous video about Alex Jones where I really let it all out on when it comes to my feelings and my opinions about some of these people on the left. But like I said, I want to digress on that. Just watch that video. Brian Kemp is a snake. He is a snake. He launched an investigation into Stacey Abrams' efforts to organize black voters, accusing her of voter fraud. I mean, read this article from Slate. I'll put the link in the description box beneath the video. Read this article, please, because there are a lot of links with complimentary articles and complimentary information backing up what's stated in this article. Okay, and I don't really have the time to go through all of that. So definitely read that article. The author of this article really backs up his position here. To understand how deeply offensive Brian Kemp finds black people voting. Read that article. He's done nothing but attack voting rights since he's been in office. Now, if you thought all of that was bad, here's where it gets worse. You know that Randolph County election board I was talking about earlier? Well, they were advised to make this move by a man named Mike Malone. Who is Mike Malone, you ask? He is not only an associate of Brian Kemp, but he's one of Kemp's donors. Not only that, but Randolph County is only the latest county Malone has approached. The article states that 10 Georgia counties have already taken Mike Malone's suggestions and have closed, or I don't know if they've done it yet, but they've approved the closure of polling places in 10 other counties across Georgia. All of these counties have large black populations, at least 25-30%, some of them 50% or more. This is bad. Malone, who actually attended the election board meeting on Thursday, literally admitted that Kemp has told him to go around and, quote, recommend polling place closures, end quote. So Kemp can pretend, because Brian Kemp has now come out, and since this election board meeting has gotten a lot of, at least like local news, and people have been talking about it online, it hasn't gotten any news nationally, which is disgusting in my honest opinion. How you have these national major platforms, these media platforms, completely ignoring voter suppression in this country because they don't want to talk about it, because they don't really want to be honest about how weak American democracy actually is, and they kind of want to pretend that the people winning are winning fair and square, which is clearly not the case in some cases. I'm not saying every election is fraudulent, okay, but some of them definitely can be, and I'm just going to leave it at that. So Kemp has, since this has gotten some attention, Kemp has kind of distanced himself from these closures and from this agenda, but don't buy that. So he can pretend to be against what's happening all he wants, but his right-hand man has already opened his mouth and exposed his entire agenda. At Thursday's meeting, and this is from the article, at Thursday's meeting, a county resident also asked Malone whether he had considered finding alternative polling places, like churches, for instance, that might be ADA compliant, because a lot of people have said, okay, well, let's say let's say they're not BSing, and these polling places are not ADA compliant. Let's give them that. That might be complete and total horse crap, but let's just give them that, right? A lot of people are saying, well, why don't you just find 7 other places that are ADA compliant? Why just say, okay, well, these polling places aren't compliant, so we're just going to shut them down. We're not going to replace them with something else. We're just going to shut them down. Malone shot back. This is what he said to this local resident. He shot back that he said he was, quote, not hired to find alternatives, end quote. Another resident asked how much he was being paid for his consultant work, from Kemp, and he refused to answer that. So, like I said, these guys are snakes. They are a major threat to democracy. There's no other way to put it. They are threats to democracy. People don't want to use that type of language when you talk about Americans. They like to use that language for foreign Muslims, right? But get Islamic fundamentalists, quite frankly, ain't got shit on the American right wing. Oh, I just broke my promise. Look at that. Far extremist. Let me find my words because I'm getting a little upset. Extremist Muslims, fundamentalist Muslims overseas ain't got shit, and yes, I'm using black vernacular, ain't got shit on the American right wing in terms of in terms of the threat that they pose to American democracy. It's not even close. It's not close. The American right wing is in direct positions, direct offices to destroy American democracy, which is essentially what they're doing. Whites only democracy is not real democracy. And that's what this is. This is whites only Jim Crow democracy. And I'm tired of I'm tired of biting my tongue about it. I'm tired of being politically correct. I am not going to be politically correct on this issue anymore. I don't know what else to say about this. I mean, before reading this article, I thought it was only happening in one county. I thought it was just happening in Randolph County, but the article states that it's already happened in 10 other counties and has been approved. From my reading of the article in those counties, it's only now Randolph County is where people have kind of become hip to it. But Mike Malone has been going around already doing this, because I was thinking to myself, like, okay, it's just one county where this is happening, and I was like, okay, well, we still have a shot if it's just this county, but no, it's worse than that. It's happening all over the state. This is much worse than I thought. And absolute silence from the media as American democracy and constitutional rights are assaulted in broad daylight is absolutely disgusting to me. They'd much rather talk about the Russia investigation for hours and hours on end as if that's the only important story in the country than actually talking about literal assaults on American democracy happening right up under their damn noses. But, it's much easier, and it suits the power structure and it suits the establishment to fearmonger about Russia. They're much more comfortable doing that than talking about American politicians who are much more of a threat to democracy than Vladimir Putin is. Yeah, I'm gonna end the video here. If you like this video, hit the like button, hit the bell beneath the video to be alerted whenever I post new videos. Go to my blog at www.blackandintellectual.com. I'm gonna try to. I want to do another video either today or tomorrow about the prison strike that's going on right now. That's something that I want to cover. I might get around to this. I might not. I want to talk about. I want to give basically an update about what's going on in South Africa with the whole land reclaiming of land from white, from the colonizers and the white farmers there. Because there's some very, strange things going on there. And I noticed with that story, I noticed how all of the Western, white-owned media is coming out against what's going on in South Africa. So yeah, I might get around to that. I might not, but I definitely want to do a video about the prison strike. So be on the lookout for that as well. And yeah, just share the video, and thanks for listening.